Guinevere Turner is an acclaimed screenwriter and director. She co-wrote the screenplays for American Psycho, The Notorious Betty Page, and most recently wrote the screenplay for Charlie Says. She also wrote and starred in the film Go Fish and was a writer and actor on Showtime's The L Word. An essay she wrote for The New Yorker is the inspiration for the memoir When the World Didn't End. She lives in New York and Los Angeles. And in this immersive, spellbinding memoir, an acclaimed screenwriter tells the story of her childhood growing up in the infamous Lyman family cult and the complicated and unexpected pain of leaving the only home she'd ever known. Hello listeners, and welcome to this week's mini-series with Guinevere Turner, the woman who wears multiple hats. I can't tell you how special it was for me to read this book and to interview Guinevere, and hopefully that is reflected in this week's conversation. A quick side note, on the 21st of October 2023 in St. Louis, Missouri, there will be a story jam hosted by the #IGotOut movement and organisers. An intimate and inspiring evening of storytelling, song, poetry and art featuring a diverse lineup of thriving survivors. Many of them you can recognise as previous guests on the Cult Vault podcast, including T. Brown, Lisa B. Free, Lisa Cohn, Dret Bouillon and Nicola Ranson. There's also a few other familiar names of people whose work I personally love, including Shannon Payton, aka Shanny Pants, who you may have seen on Instagram and whose content I highly recommend. The first annual Story Jam is happening in St. Louis. Be they cults, high-demand groups, organisations or companies, spiritually abusive churches or families, or high-control schools or programmes, our stories can shed light on the dynamics that held us captive, taken from the igotout.org website. If you have been involved in a power-over abusive environment or are willing to listen to cautionary tales and miraculous misadventures, miraculous because we got out and survived, we hope you'll join us for an intimate evening of creative performances by fellow cult survivors and advocates. In collaboration with Tears of Eden, igotout.org is cooking up a live and in-person cult survivor story jam. For more information and tickets to the story jam and ways that you can sponsor the event, you can visit igotout.org or follow the links in the episode description. Now on to today's mini-series with Guinevere Turner. So hello Guinevere and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for agreeing to come and chat with me today about your life, your experiences, and your newly published memoir, When the World Didn't End. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Hello, Casey. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Guinevere Turner. I am a screenwriter. I'm an actor. I am a director. I am all around what sounds like, when I say all those things out loud, a Hollywood gal, but I'm not. I'm actually talking from Brooklyn, New York, where I live with my partner and my beloved dog Marbles. And I wrote this book about my experience growing up in the Lyman family, which was a cult that I was born into and couldn't find a way to write about for 50 years. But here I am at 55 and I wrote it.
It's fascinating to hear you word it that way, because your book is made up of diary entries that you wrote growing up within the group and experiences that kind of followed your time with the Lyman family. So in a way, you've always been writing about this group, but putting it into a memoir in the way that you have is fantastic, having this kind of source material and wording it this way. So you've had all these different creative ventures and these masterpieces that you've been an integral part of, and now you've found the space or the time or the motivation to finish this memoir.
I feel like the sort of heart of that statement was a question, which is like, why now, right? Like why did you choose to write this book after all these years? And it's so I in 2019 I made a film with my longtime collaborator Mary Herron. We made American Psycho, we made Notorious Betty Page, we made this one. It's called Charlie Says. And Charlie Says is about the women who killed for Charles Manson and really focused around their time in prison, which is like I don't know, everyone's like, you know, the orgies, the drugs, the trial, the blah blah blah. But then like we lost public interest in like what I mean, those women didn't die. They went to prison. And the story of them in prison is incredibly fascinating. And I love that movie. I'm so proud of that movie. But I was saying to Mary, I was like, I'm so sorry, but like everybody's gonna want to talk to me about my own cult experience when we're doing publicity for this movie. And I know from experience that when you talk about growing up in a cult, people are just like, wait, what? And just like, you know, ready for all the deets. And I spent a lot of my, you know, adult publicity career just pivoting away from this story because like was not relevant to any movie that I was in the business of promoting. And so, but I said, Mary, I'm sorry, this is going to happen. And like, now it is relevant. And I do need to talk about the fact that I wanted to write this movie because I felt that I had something to bring to it that not, maybe no screenwriter does. And she was like, well, you should write a piece about your experience and, you know, get ahead of the conversation. And I was like, oh my God, I wish you'd said that to me 5 months ago. But so I wrote a piece and amazingly, it got into the New Yorker. And that was like the interest, the level of like response to it was so overwhelmingly great. You know, both acknowledging me as a writer, but like, you know, from like cult survivors all over, just like came for me, like just in all these brilliant ways. And I was like, and then all of a sudden people wanted me to write a book. And I was like, fuck, I guess it's time. I guess it's time after all these years. And what was so interesting is that when I wrote that essay in the New Yorker, it's like May 2019, amazingly, they published it 3 days before the movie came out. So every journalist was like, I read your piece in the New Yorker. How did your childhood inform this movie? Instead of being like, what about your childhood? You know, it was amazing. Mary's a genius. I just all of a sudden was like, okay, it's time. But when I was writing the New Yorker essay, I was more afraid. Like nothing I've ever written has made me fearful. Writing is my joy. Writing is my life. Writing is an extension of myself. But when I was writing this piece, I was like, there was like a permanent knot in my stomach. And I was like, what chip did they put in us that we will never speak of this? And I'm like, I've been out of that family since I was 11 years old. And yet I'm terrified at 50, whatever I was, 51 or something, to talk about it. And I'm like, fuck that, power through. But like literally, no one that I grew up with, and my generation is like, you know, 60 something people, has ever written about it or spoken about it publicly. And I had never really thought about that. And I was like, okay, so I'm the first one. And I'm like, okay, actually, like, let's think about this. Like, you actually are the voice of a very specific, very small generation, but still, like this is powerful. Like you have access to you know, people paying attention to what you write. Like it's fucking time, girl. But I was just like, so like once I did that, then I was like, a book, sure. You know, that was the hard part. And believe me, people came for me, like people that I grew up with, and my aunt, who is, you know, my mom's sister, who's still in the family, like called me crying, you know, just like, please don't do this. And I was like, oh, I'm sorry.
Done.
Should I just be like, I'm sorry, New Yorker, I can't because my aunt is crying. I'm like, bye. It's like, no, I'm doing this. So anyway, that was a really long ass answer, but that's a whole thing about how this book started and about like my own kind of like the thing I needed to jump over to write the story was the one of the more intense things I've ever experienced creatively.
It's interested to hear you use the word intense. And in my questions on the question list, I wrote, to use the term cult in a different context. You wrote the cult classic American Psycho. Looking back on some of the things that you've written, is it clear to you that some of the kind of psychological parts of of certain kind of psychological thrillers, psychological horrors, is inspired by any events of your childhood, or is it just the Hollywood gal inside you that gives you the ability to write such amazing pieces?
I think it's funny because when I was like I got this amazing, beautiful lit agent, and he basically taught me how to write a book proposal, which is, I don't know if anyone who's listening understands, but like it's a lot. And he was not fucking around. He was like, you need to write 2 chapters. And I did that. And that was also like one of those steps where I was like, okay, I can do anything, because I deliberately chose 2 really difficult points from my childhood. And I was like, yep, I can write that. I mean, thank you, Tito's vodka, but whatever. Because I would write it, and then I would write it drunk, and then I would, like, go back sober and be like, okay, girl, get it together. But like I just needed that like push. Um uh and so when I was in this journey of like, talking to editors and publishers with this 40-page book proposal, there's this one woman who's like a grand dame of publishing. Her name's Kate Medina. Red power suit, pearls. Huh. It's funny actually, because I'm ironically wearing pearls, but is it ironic? Um, I don't know if it's ironic anymore. I just kind of like them. And it's like $8 on Amazon. Do you know what I mean? Not my grandma's pearls. She said, so you wrote American Psycho, and you wrote, this movie Charlie Says, and she's like, what's the through line? Like, what, like, how are these things connected? And I was like very, I don't know, like out of my depth in terms of the publishing world. So, like feeling like I just spent all these decades understanding how Hollywood works, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like so comfortable in all of those rooms. But all of a sudden I'm like, I'm weirdly a writer, but like I'm also talking to people who, like, they're selling themselves to me. That is so unfamiliar to me. I'm always selling myself to other people. And they know they open with like, this, these pages are amazing, like your story's amazing, I'm like, oh. But anyway, she said, what's the through line with your work? And I said, toxic masculinity. And she said, toxic masculinity, what a great turn of phrase, I'm going to use that. I was like, I don't know how to gracefully tell her, like, I did not make up this concept. This turn of phrase, but like clearly American Psycho came out in 2000. Like this was not, a common phrase, like, culturally, present in the way that it is now and has been for years, thank God. So anyway, toxic masculinity is the answer to your question with a very, very elaborate setup.
There's definitely some parts in the book When the World Didn't End where I found myself kind of reading and taking like shorter breaths and being like, oh no, what's going to happen, what's going to happen. And it gave me that sort of feeling that you do get when you're watching like a psychological horror or thriller, where you're like, oh no, something bad's going to happen. And I have a specific example of that I want to dive into in a little while. But when I began reading your memoir, and with the title When the World Didn't End, my preconception was that it was going to be about like a Christian doomsday cult or something along those lines. Because most of my experience up to this point, when there are doomsday prophecies, is usually something to do with a major religion of some type, or a sect inside a major religion. So I was surprised when I began reading the book to realize that it was about something very different, specifically about a group I've never heard of. And I
Mhm.
wondered if you could give the listeners a sort of rundown of the group that you were a part of growing up and some historical context and where you specifically place into that timeline.
I was so I grew up in this cult called the Lyman family. And like every cult, at least back then, they did not call themselves a cult. To this day, I don't think they would call themselves, I know they would not call themselves a cult. They are still alive and well, old, but whatever. And so it's important to note that when I tell you the story of this family, it's not, it comes from the space of being born into it. And so I didn't, like, it's not like the doctrine was handed to me. It's just like how I grew up. But the leader of this cult, Mel Lyman, he started the family in like 66, I think. I was born in 68. He was very anti-hippie identity. He wrote a book. He wrote two books. One, The Mirror at the End of the Road, and the second, Autobiography of a World Savior. So you can get a vibe from that. He I was if he was if you read the book you'll see by the time I was old enough to think critically, I guess, which was like 8, he was away, he was sequestered, and the wisdom was that he just decided that he wanted to live a nightlife, like sleep during the day and be awake at night, which I, later learned was because he had cancer and he didn't want anyone to see. And then he died, and the family continued most of them thinking that he was alive. Their beliefs, it's so interesting to think about. And obviously I thought a lot about this when writing this book. I'm shaking my head right now for listeners because it's so hard to articulate. About souls, like, if, like, is your soul good, is your soul in the right place, are you in the right place, like lots of astrology. So I'm a Gemini, but like, don't let me give you that Scorpio rising, because that's how I was scolded as a child. um um just a lot about being present. But then, like, like any adult could look at you and say, like, your eyes look dead. And like, what are you going to do with that? Like, make your eyes alive. I don't know. Like, we were raised with this like very amorphous kind of like, you're never doing it right. There's a lot of reincarnation talk. And then eventually, which hence the title of my book, that, the world was going to end. Like, the world was going to blow up, I guess. Fire, I don't know. And we were going to be all taken to Venus by UFOs. And that's where we were going to live. As I say in my book, I was like, as a teenager, I was like, oh, college educated woman who worked on Wall Street. What the fuck? Like, I don't know. I mean, we didn't have Google at the time, but like, we pretty much know that Venus is not an inhabitable place by mammals or humans. I guess that's the same thing. And she just said it's complicated. And I was like, I'm listening. I'm like, I'm listening now that I'm a teenager, and now that I'm really able to look at what the fuck we came through. I'm dying to know what the fuck.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a very thought terminating cliche where somebody just says it's complicated and expects you to just go, oh, okay.
Yeah, which I wasn't at all at the time. I was just like, okay, like, you're not ready to talk about it, nor will you ever be. Or maybe like the house of cards that you've built for yourself post cult is something that I shouldn't poke out right now because you're just, trying to survive and, fucking live with your choices. So I didn't poke her. But anyway, that's where I come from.
There were some parts of, I mean, apart from the anti-hippie aspect, there were some parts of the writing that reminded me of Helen Zuman's writing in Mating in Captivity about her time on Zendik Farm, how there was a male role model figure head who was then, once he passed, almost replaced by a matriarchal figure who changed some things, and their homestead was on a big farm, and there were aspects of that story that felt familiar with the information that you provided in your memoir. But it was slightly different with the Lyman family because it wasn't just in one location. There were several different places where members of this particular group existed.
Yeah, so we grew up, they had at the time 5 compounds. They still have them, except they have one more now in Mexico. Martha's Vineyard, Boston, New York, LA, San Francisco, Kansas. And Kansas is where I spent a lot of my time. That was a big farm. And LA and Martha's Vineyard. So they have like a lot of land. And I grew up, traveling among these places. Kind of, there was a thing. So Jessie was, the leader, really, because Mel Lyman was dead, but not dead, but whatever. And she, once a year, she would travel from Los Angeles, that compound there, to ultimately to the vineyard, which is like where she grew up. Ish, like summer home. And if you were lucky, very lucky, you got to travel with her in a caravan of like 5 vehicles and going across the land and like stopping in Kansas where that farm was and all of that. And it's in my book that I was just a lowly kid until the caravan came by, and her daughter, she has 2 daughters, but her daughter Daria just, decided that I was, she just wanted me, basically. Just wanted me to be her handmaiden. And I was swooped up into this caravan and became a part of the elite, which I think is also like something that makes my story unique because I got to see both sides, and I got to experience how the girls, it's all about girls. I grew up with a lot of boys too, but it's all about the girls. The girls who were lowly like me before called me out, basically, and were like, "Oh, you're fancy now." And I'm like, "Don't say that," but it was true. But I wasn't really fancy because I was actually a servant.
The really touching parts of the memoir include moments of kind of carefree, innocent childhood, which is kind of jarring in some places because there'll be really lovely carefree moments of like, kids running through the farm, having experiences, doing things that children do, mixed in with things in like, oh, the end of the world is coming, oh, you're reincarnated, oh, you're an old soul, you must have been here before. And it's kind of jarring to have that juxtaposition of having indoctrination mixed in with these really innocent experiences. Could you give us some description of the community that you grew up in and some key moments from your childhood that stick out in terms of those more innocent experiences?
I mean, I deliberately wrote it this way because I really wanted to wrote the book When the World Didn't End This Way, because I wanted to subvert several things that are happening in the cultiverse. As I think it was you actually, maybe it was you, it was Esther Friedman. Anyway, this cultiverse term is very useful to me because I am in it in all these really interesting ways. Um, just, for starters, being a survivor of one. I wanted to, I was responding to this question. So when you talk about growing up in a cult, I learned early on, people are just like fascinated and they ask inappropriate questions and they just are like, oh God, was it this? Was it that? And they want like the dirtiest, scrappiest, most painful details, which is like rude. First of all, this is rude. I'm like, how was your childhood? Is what I usually say. Um, because everyone has a fucked up childhood. It's fucked up to be a child. And so what I wanted to telegraph in this story is like actually so much beauty, like so much, like my relationship to being a kid surrounded by kids. And yes, we had chores, yes, we were working in fields, we were doing like so much manual labor, but it was fun. Like it's fun to be around a bunch of kids when you're a kid, like nonstop, day and night, like we're singing, we're laughing, we're running, we're doing like this was our lives. And yeah, dark shit around every corner, but like in actual fact, like something that I hold dear to myself and miss is like growing up that way, like growing up with like intense community. And even though the adults were mostly incredibly punishing and scary, unlike most people, I grew up with like 8 hours a day of just being like feral children running around on a farm. You know what I mean? And that was like, that is like who I am in my heart. I'm always looking for community. I'm always looking for that, like that feeling of like, oh yeah, let's just like fuck around and just do whatever, Um, in my book, I I wrote this one experience of this kid getting his fingers chopped off. And it's funny because, I've been doing book events and stuff, and I was trying to find a part of it that is kind of palatable in this context, and I always introduce it by saying, I know it's weird that a kid getting his fingers chopped off is the most heartwarming story that I can tell, but it really is because, I love this kid and like, I had to pick up his fingers off the chopping block, etc. And like, it sort of underlines like, oh, what happens when you give a bunch of 7, 8, and 9-year-olds an axe and ask them to chop wood? Like, well, how's that going to go? Do you think? Someone's fingers are going to get chopped off, and they did. But the way that I tell that story, to me, like just sort of exemplifies like beauty and horror all in the same, and how we took it all kind of in stride as kids, because that was our life, you know? And that's like what I constantly think about when people ask me, like, well, before I wrote a book, what was your childhood like? I'm like, I'm pretty sure that I can ask you, Casey, or anyone, can you name a fucking horrific thing that happened to you when you were a kid? And we all have the answer. Something fucked up happened to us, of course, because that's what it means to be alive.
There are several moments in the early parts of When the World Did End that talk about animals. And it's very clear to me now from our conversation before we hit record that the animals are a big passion of yours, and invoke some very strong emotional responses from you when we talk about animals that we love, animals that we've had. And growing up on this farm, you were surrounded by all of this manual labor that involved having to work with animals. And even though listeners who might hear us talking about certain things happening on farms that aren't specifically cult related, like having these chickens that are growing up and you're growing up and the chickens are growing up alongside you, and then all of a sudden the chickens are going to be served for dinner, and it's part of your job to help that happen. There'll be people that are maybe listening that grew up on farms themselves, or in situations where they had to experience that as well. But those are some of the more difficult parts of the book to read from your child's perspective, because it's clear of the impact that it had on you as a child. So do you think your love of animals came from that time? Or, I mean, this is a hypothetical question, so it might be impossible to answer. Would you still have the same love for animals that you do now had you not been around them so much as a child?
I'm making a face right now. That is just me thinking that I have something very clever to say right now, which is it's kind of chicken egg, isn't it? It's funny that you ask that, because you will not be the first person to ask that. And I'm like, I'm sort of like deeply amused by how that's like a takeaway that people get from the book, because obviously I am like an animal lover. Like I can't even fucking kill a mosquito. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm just an animal lover. I'm a creature lover. I respect life. I know that's like a cringy thing to say, but I really do. Like I really don't think that I deserve to kill anything, or that anyone does. Chicken egg though, chicken egg. No, I don't think that my love of animals comes from that space, because when I look back on it, like before the animals that I knew and loved were killed, I was already so deeply attached to them. And this is like the first time I'm saying this out loud, but what I'm thinking about is that I feel like they were the only thing more helpless than me. And there was something about my little kid nature that was like, I can help. Like this is not hopeless. And then, they slaughtered them and I had to pull their guts out, but whatever. I'm fine.
That is the end of part 1 of this mini-series on the Lyman family. For more information on the I Got Out Story Jam, for Guinevere's work, or to get in touch with me, you can follow the links in the episode description, or find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com, and follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.